Thank you, Andrew. And for everyone here and on Zoom, in the closing weeks of our exhibition, I am really excited to speak about this portrait miniature, generously on loan, as Andrew said, from the city of Charleston. Um, Maybe I shouldn't say this, it's like picking between children, but it is one of my favorite things in this exhibition. So we'll take a closer look at the portrait, when and why it was painted, and what it tells us about Lafayette and the Society of the Cincinnati. So it was painted during Lafayette's farewell tour of the United States. The tour itself was Lafayette's idea. In late 1823, the 66-year-old had written to President James Monroe, a fellow veteran of the Revolution, of his desire to visit what he called the happy shores of an adopted land, which has so filled my first and most presumptuous hopes. Admittedly, Lafayette was also having both political and financial troubles in France, which an American tour would hopefully provide an escape from. He had been defeated in his bid for re-election to the Chamber of Deputies in 1823. He opposed the restored King Louis XIII, and at various times was under surveillance by opponents of his in the French government. So life in France wasn't entirely comfortable for Lafayette at this time. He originally planned a 4-month tour through the original 13 states, but this grew to what would become a 14-month journey from August 1824 to September 1825. He visited all 24 states of what was then the Union of the United States and the federal city of Washington as well. A really interesting aspect of this tour is how he traveled across the country. What was then still an expanse, but he traveled by carriage, coach, and boat, and encountered all sorts of difficult roads, storms, illnesses along the way. But everywhere he went, drew unprecedented crowds to parades, speeches, dinners, balls, worship services, ceremonies, important sites, like anniversaries of battles, cornerstone layings, Masonic ceremonies. So this really was an exhausting journey for him. As an example, one of my favorite accounts I've read of Lafayette's tour was when he visited Beaufort, South Carolina. And the residents there were so eager to see him. And he only was sailing by overnight in March of 1825 on his way from Charleston to Savannah. And it was about midnight. Hundreds still waited on the shore for a glimpse of him. And as his secretary, Auguste Levasseur, wrote, "It was nearly midnight when we passed in front of Beaufort, and everyone on board was sleeping. But we were soon awakened by the shouts of the citizens who had waited up to then on the bank, and General Lafayette, having gotten up, gave in to their entreaty that he spend some moments among them." So they were so excited to see him that they were just not even expecting he actually set foot in their town, but lining the river just to see him sail by. And then, of course, merchants and manufacturers took advantage of the fervor over Lafayette's tour by producing and selling goods commemorating his life and his visit. They put his face on medals, buttons, ribbons, gloves, plates, pictures, etc. And like you see in the ceramic plate in this slide, which depicts Lafayette landing at Castle Garden in New York City in August 1824 at the start of his tour. And then, interestingly, this was made by the firm of James and Ralph Clews of Staffordshire, England. So even across the Atlantic, British merchants in particular were making these goods for the American market to celebrate this French hero. The portrait was more specifically painted during Lafayette's visit to Charleston, South Carolina in March of 1825, where he arrived in middle of the month, as his secretary wrote, with much difficulty and very late at night. He had been coming from Columbia and ended up after dark in a strong rainstorm that deteriorated the road. He and his traveling companions were in a series of 3 carriages. 2 of the 3 broke down. Lafayette's is the only one that didn't break, but he and others got out in the rain, in the dark, in apparently the thick of the woods, to push one of the other carriages out of the way so that those who fit could pile on into his carriage so they could carry on, which happened for a little while until the horses got spooked and pulled the carriage, the one working carriage, off into the woods, where they had to kind of sit stuck for the next hour while their some of their party could then ride on horseback away and come back with help. Just a little window, I think, into what some of his journey was like. So finally, he reaches Charleston, can recover from that, and is in a procession into the city that included local militia, volunteer cavalry, clergy, judges, school children, artisans, and I think very meaningfully, Revolutionary War veterans and members of the Society of the Cincinnati and the city. And this is typical of what was happening when Lafayette was entering cities and towns across the US. Um, Specifically in Charleston, he was accompanied into the city by Colonel Francis Huger, who had actually helped welcome Lafayette to America as a child in 1777, when he landed just outside Charleston, and first took steps on American soil. Huger also later in life tried to rescue Lafayette from imprisonment in Olmütz in Austria in the 1790s, so they became close. That incident actually resulted in Huger's own capture, so they kind of shared that experience. And to sort of tie more of this together, Charles Fraser, the artist of this portrait of Lafayette, also painted a portrait of Francis Huger, which the city presented to Lafayette during his visit to Charleston. That portrait's now in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this procession ended at City Hall, where the mayor gave a speech, followed by Colonel William Drayton, a member of the Society of the Cincinnati, who was able to address the crowd and Lafayette on behalf of the society, and then Lafayette responded. Lafayette was staying for a time at St. Andrew's Society Hall in Charleston, which then was decorated in his honor with portraits of George Washington, James Monroe, and Andrew Jackson from the city's collection, as well as portraits of Henry Laurens and his son John, who was a close friend of Lafayette's and a fellow Revolutionary War officer who had died near the end of the war. On March 16th, so the second of the 3-day visit Lafayette would have in Charleston, Lafayette attended a dinner held in his honor by the Society of the Cincinnati. The South Carolina governor was also in attendance, along with other dignitaries and military officials. Thomas Pinckney, who was then the president of the South Carolina Society, addressed Lafayette and then presided over a series of 13 toasts, being given first to our nation's guest, followed by, among other things, toasts to the memory of Washington, Greene, Moultrie, and DeKalb. And then the next day, March 17th, 1825, Lafayette departed Charleston on his way to Savannah. So the artist of our portrait, Charles Fraser, was South Carolina, Charleston born and bred, but of Scottish ancestry. He was the son of Alexander Fraser and Mary Grimke, both of whom had died by about the time Charles was 10 years old. He was raised in a 2-story wooden house on Trad Street, then moved to a 2-story brick home, then a double tenement on King Street, which was also owned by the family. And I'll, as an aside, mention that the reference to a tenement here simply at the time meant a residence for rent. In Charleston, especially at the time, this could be quite a spacious and well-furnished residence. So this does not have the same connotations that we may think of in New York City or other northern places closer to the turn of the 20th century. So Fraser's first career was as a practicing attorney. He practiced law until 1818, when he decided to take a sort of lifelong interest in painting into a career. He had had formal training only briefly in the 1790s at an art school in Charleston, along with Thomas Sully. He also came to know Edward Malbone and John Blake White, and had also previously met with John Trumbull and Gilbert Stuart on a visit to Newport, Rhode Island. So he had started to sort of become part of this world. And in just 7 years before Lafayette arrived in Charleston, Fraser had already become the leading miniaturist in Charleston. His clients were wealthy and prominent Southerners, including some aging veterans of the Revolution like William Moultrie, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and William Richardson Davie. He would paint more than 500 paintings over his career, and at some point traveled up and down the East Coast, not just working in Charleston. An interesting diversion from his portrait commissions is landscape views in the Charleston area that he painted, which really provide an important record of the homes and buildings at the turn of the 19th century in the area. This example that I chose is his family's plantation, Wigton, near Goose Creek, that I believe his grandfather had established earlier in the 18th century. So Fraser would be 42 years old when he painted Lafayette in March of 1825. So for a closer look at the portrait, it is watercolor on ivory, and it's typical of the size of these miniatures for the period, although larger. If you've seen 18th century miniatures, more circular locket style, this is much larger than that. But it's about 5.5 inches high by 4.5 inches wide. It is contained in a larger gilt wood frame, which isn't pictured here. But you do see, maybe if you compare this with the self-portrait of Fraser we just saw, you see a similar sort of stippling, these really short lines, especially in the background, which is a hallmark of Fraser's style. So what he painted was what would have been a very familiar view of Lafayette during his tour, but with a distinctive addition. That medal hanging off of the light blue and white ribbon of his coat is the insignia of the Society of the Cincinnati that we call the Eagle. And what you see on the right here is a similar likeness. This is the most famous image created for Lafayette's tour, painted by Ari Scheffer in France before the tour. Lafayette brought it to America, presented it to Congress in 1824. So even though these are different images and poses, and Lafayette sat in person for Fraser, he wasn't copying this Scheffer portrait, you still see the overcoat, the face, the hairstyle is so Lafayette of the tour. The painting was commissioned by the city of Charleston. And what's wonderful that's preserved at the Gibbs Museum of Art in Charleston is Fraser's book of records. And so what we see here towards the bottom right of the page that's pulled out to make it a little bit bigger is a record of Fraser having painted the portrait of General Lafayette executed on March 17th, 1825. There's no fee recorded, and if you can see the other numbers that are next to the other entries, there is no number next to this entry. I'm not sure if that means the city didn't have to pay, but he was typically charging $40 to $50 for other miniatures at the same time. And Fraser would have been somewhat familiar with the insignia of the Society of the Cincinnati. He had painted it at least once before in this 1802 portrait of William Moultrie that survives at the Walters Art Museum. And then Lafayette's portrait of by Fraser was exhibited at least perhaps for the first time in a gallery of Fraser's works shown in Charleston in 1857, which was 3 years before the artist's death. But it has remained since then mostly at City Hall in Charleston. So more about this eagle that he's wearing. The eagle that he wore in the portrait was actually made in 1784 for George Washington. And quick background on the eagle itself. This is the badge of membership of the Society of the Cincinnati that its members would wear. This hereditary organization was founded by veteran officers of the American and French militaries of the Revolutionary War to commemorate the achievements of American independence and the ideals of the Revolution. So George Washington, Lafayette, Alexander Hamilton, about 2,200 other veteran officers became original members. It's a double-sided gold insignia designed by Pierre L'Enfant, who was also a member, using the shape of a bald eagle and picturing on oval medallions on either side the images of an ancient Roman hero, Cincinnatus, who was the namesake of the society. The first examples were made under L'Enfant's direction in Paris in early 1784. So this would have been as well. And so what this is this eagle he was wearing is a unique, distinctive example, specifically made for Washington on his own request to Lafayette. It survives today. The original you see on the right with the blue background, which survives today, owned by the Schembrun Foundation. It's at Lagrange, Lafayette's home, and the Schembrun Foundation's mission is to preserve the chateau and its contents and to share the stories of Lafayette and his family. That remains in France, but what we have here displayed in our exhibition from our collections, you see on the left on the black background, which is a replica of this eagle that in 1830 Lafayette gave permission to have made. It was made on the orders of Charles Stewart Davies, who was a member of the Massachusetts Society of the Cincinnati. I don't actually know what motivated him, Davies, to have this replica made. And you can certainly see side by side differences, and the replica is not nearly as detailed in the eagle and the gold work, but otherwise a fair representation of it. So again, on the right, we see the eagle that Lafayette was wearing in the portrait. And when Washington asked for it to be made, he asked in October 1783 that the eagle be, quote, finished in a masterly manner, but ornamented in an elegant, though not in a costly style. That's it. That's the direction that that Washington gave to L'Enfant. And so L'Enfant, we assume, took it upon himself to make something unique for Washington. It's the only one that has the wreath going all the way around the body. What you see on the left with the dark blue background is from our collections. This is what we consider the standard form of the eagle badge that was made at the same time under L'Enfant's direction. And so what you see in Lafayette's eagle is this smaller, slender body, smaller, simpler medallions, and then, of course, that wreath all the way around. And Washington may have intended this to be the badge he would wear as President General, but we're not sure he ever received it, as he received at the same time as he got this, the Diamond Eagle of the Society, which you may be familiar with, a surprise gift from French naval officers that then superseded this that Washington ordered. So how did this get to Lafayette? After Washington's death, the eagle passed to his widow, Martha, then was inherited by her granddaughter, who was also George Washington's adopted granddaughter, Eleanor, called Nellie Custis Lewis. This eagle was listed in Washington's 1800 inventory, or the 1800 inventory of Washington's estate, listed together with another just standard gold eagle of the society, together for $30. By comparison, the Diamond Eagle was listed for something like $387. So Nellie was the youngest of Martha Washington's granddaughters through her first marriage to Daniel Parke Custis. She moved in with her grandparents at Mount Vernon during the Revolutionary War, after her father's death in camp after the siege of Yorktown in the fall of 1781. And then her mother remarried, so she moved in with her grandparents. In 1799, she married Lawrence Lewis, who was a nephew of George Washington's. They lived at Mount Vernon until just after Martha Washington's death in 1802, when they built their own home, Woodlawn, which was just about 2 miles away. Woodlawn is now a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation in Alexandria, Virginia. So Nellie has custody of the eagle. And she decided, because of the relationship between her grandfather and Lafayette, that Lafayette should have and would appreciate this eagle. So in November of 1824, Lafayette was in Virginia and visited Nellie's family, and she was able to give it to him, but not quite in the way that I initially expected. So Lafayette spent most of the winter of 1824, 1825 in the Washington area, as well as his son, George Washington Lafayette. They both visited the Lewis family several times at Woodlawn. In late November 1824, George stayed at Woodlawn while his father went on to other obligations in Fredericksburg. And George and Nellie had also known each other from George's time at Mount Vernon in the 1790s, when Lafayette had sent his son to live in Virginia to escape the terror in France. So Nellie had a fond relationship both with George and his father, and she viewed Lafayette as sort of an extension of her beloved grandfather. Nellie was in the crowd at Castle Garden in New York City when Lafayette arrived in August of 1824. And she was probably at Mount Vernon in October of 1824 when the Marquis paid his respects to Washington's tomb. But that's not when she gave him the eagle. She waited until November 22nd, 1824, when she gave it to George with instructions that he present it to his father, who was then in Fredericksburg. So George did that when the two were reunited in Fredericksburg. And Nellie Custis explains this in a letter to her good friend, Elizabeth Bordley Gibson, written the same day. And she just simply said, I have committed to the care of George the Order of the Cincinnati. Lafayette would thank Nellie in person when he spent 4 days at Woodlawn in early December of 1824. And in a letter of thanks, Lafayette termed the eagle a kind, precious, and doubly filial present. This is the only portrait painted during the tour of the very many paintings done during the tour that pictures Lafayette wearing the Society Eagle. And it's actually the only portrait that depicts this eagle ever. There are no portraits, certainly, of George Washington wearing it. And this portrait of Lafayette by Charles Fraser is one of at least 3 portraits that I know of done over Lafayette's lifetime to include the Society Eagle insignia. The other 2 you see on the screen. On the far left is a bust by Jean-Antoine Houdon from about the mid-1780s. That's at the Boston Athenaeum today. And then in the middle, an oil portrait by Joseph Bose, painted in 1790. He's wearing his French National Guard uniform and some medals of the early French Revolution, along with the Society Eagle. It's probably very small to see here, but that's at the Massachusetts Historical Society. And 3 may not necessarily sound like a lot, but even for other prominent members of the society at the time, I don't know of anyone else who has had this many portraits in the founding generation painted with or made with the Society Eagle. So the society clearly meant a lot to Lafayette. Thinking about why this portrait in Charleston in March of 1825 would have had the eagle added to it. Certainly the society, in part to Lafayette, represented his relationship with Washington, as well as other Revolutionary War compatriots. I think Lafayette saw in the society an extension of his pride of his service in America in the Revolution, as well as defeating the British, and his commitment to the principles of the Revolution and how that was represented in the society's mission. Lafayette was actually instrumental in establishing the French branch of the society, which started happening with meetings in Paris that Lafayette organized in January of 1784, culminating in the formal organization of the French branch in July of 1784, with Admiral d'Estaing as its first president. So this portrait survives not just as a record of Lafayette's farewell tour in America and time in Charleston, but also a document of his membership in and commitment to the Society of the Cincinnati. And that's where I leave you. So I would encourage any of you here or who will be here over the next few weeks, you can see this portrait in person here in our exhibition through the end of the year, before it goes back to Charleston. Those of you at home, we have more information on our website about this exhibition and the Eagle in general as well. So I encourage you to look at that. And happy to take any questions.
How many other portraits were done of Lafayette during this time?
How many? How many other portraits were done of Lafayette during the tour while he was here? I'm going to say dozens, but that may not even be enough. I mean, if you're talking about original works of art, I mean, there were a number of cities and organizations commissioning portraits of Lafayette, and it probably at least half a dozen leading artists of the day in America who ended up with these commissions. But then you also would have some of these more successful portraits would then be reproduced as prints that would be sold. And then the most prominent of them, that portrait that I showed you that was presented at the Capitol, that face is then what was reproduced on all of those commercial goods. And actually, Lafayette, when he brought the oil painting to present to the Capitol, he had already had engravings, fine engravings of that portrait done in France. And he brought a stack of those over too that he could distribute. So he had already kind of done some of the legwork for that. Yeah.
So the artist that did the miniature, Lafayette sat for him to do that portrait?
Yeah. So question about Lafayette sitting really in person for Charles Fraser to have this miniature done. Yes. I don't exactly know how he fit that into his schedule, but March 17th is when Fraser records in his book of records he made that painting, which was Lafayette's last day in Charleston. So, and he had sort of a partial day in the city before he left to head off to Savannah. So he would have sat for Fraser in person. I mean, the thing about miniatures, and is one of the things I love about them, is that they were usually done pretty quickly. Um, and so they're this very sort of immediate, accurate kind of likeness of a person without spending days in a studio with or without the person. So they could what's still a very beautiful, intricate, um, kind of crisp record of Lafayette, I think for Fraser would have been a fairly quick work for him to do, just at most in a few hours that day.
About general, how were they typically displayed by their
So a question about portrait miniatures in general and how they were typically displayed by their owners. And this evolves from the 18th into this part of the 19th century. In the late 18th century, as I mentioned, they're much smaller, oval locket style miniatures that would have a very slim gold case and a loop at the top, and they were designed to be worn. Miniatures in general were thought of as a sort of intimate, personal um, likeness of someone. So if you think about it as sort of a version of the cell phone photos you have of your family, or the background you have on your phone of your family, that it was something that you kept close to you and that was given typically to a very close relative, husband to a wife or to a mother, that sort of thing, and typically for women in the 18th century. And they were designed as lockets because they were worn. So you were designed to kind of physically keep this person close to you. And so worn as pendants or sometimes as bracelets. That starts to change in the 19th century because miniatures just keep growing in size as you get into the 1790s and then certainly into the 19th century, and they start to, instead of having that oval form with the slim gold case and the loop at the top, they just get kind of unwieldy big for that. And so more kind of rectangular paper mache frames start to come into fashion, or gold frames. And they could be displayed in the home, um, in a cabinet, maybe. They're still small relatively. This is not something that, a large oil painting that's going over the mantle. So they could be displayed at home, but I think they were still considered um, still more kind of personal, domestic um, portraits rather than more formal kind of display pieces. If that makes sense.
scale?
Good one. Did Fraser leave any account of his interactions with Lafayette? Not that I found, I will admit. I'm not an expert by any means on Charles Fraser, and was grateful to even find the things that I did preserved at the Gibbs about his financials and his record book, which you always hope for and don't often have. I I have not run across papers of Charles Fraser, otherwise letters or diaries or things like that. They certainly may exist. I didn't go that far. And I mean, it's not mentioned in any of the accounts that I read of Lafayette's tour in Charleston, some of which go into great detail about who he met with and where he was and who came to see him and what organizations he visited. But there isn't a mention that I've seen of accounts of his time in Charleston of this sitting, which would have been a more private engagement, I think.
would like to know. What was
So question is related to Lafayette and Washington's membership in the society, and having read that Washington wasn't so enthusiastic about the society, despite being its president general from 1783 till his death in 1799. This is a characterization that we hear a lot, and it's honestly hard to know. Washington did accept being president general of the society. He retained that position for the rest of his life. He was more engaged in the first couple years of the society's existence at its meetings, and admittedly, he was not such a fan of the hereditary principle of membership in the society, that it was set up as a hereditary organization so that male descendants of the officers and the original members would the membership would carry on through them. And the idea with that was that so that there would be this hopefully built-in community of people generation after generation who would have these familial reasons to care about perpetuating the society's mission. But it was criticized in the founding period as being another version of an aristocracy, another kind of elitist organization. We just overthrew the British. Why does this seemingly elitist organization exist? Which does not seem to have been the society's intentions, but it was read that way, sort of understandably from the outside. So Washington wanted that to be abolished, for there to be no hereditary principle. And the other members of the society really seriously weighed that for years. It actually wasn't even resolved until after Washington's death, when they decided to keep the hereditary principle. So I think that really was a divide between Washington and the society. And certainly he has other things to do at this point than be really intimately involved in the society, especially once he becomes president of the United States. So that limits his involvement as well. But that said, I think about things like he had an extensive service of the Society of the Cincinnati China, made the Chinese export porcelain service. He had 302 pieces of it. We know he used it when he was in New York as president. He used it at Mount Vernon. Much of it survives there. So even after he had this sort of divide with the society's leadership over the hereditary principle, he's still putting its insignia on his dinner table for any of the other, whether it's his kind of neighbors coming to dinner or members of government or other important folks. He's still putting that on his table. So I like to think that there's a sort of ideological, emotional connection that remains between Washington and the society over his life, even if he didn't remain as engaged as you might think he was as president general. It's a very long-winded answer. Well, if there are no other questions, I'll thank you very much for your attention, and hope you'll join us again next time.